Good morning, everyone. I'm glad you could be here today. We have several students out, probably for weather reasons most likely, because it is seriously cold out there, bitter cold. And so I'm going to be recording the class today. The first thing I'd like to do is I'd like to return some homework that I got from you guys the last time we met, which seems like a long time ago. It has been quite a while. So it'll just take me a minute as usual to return it. You made it okay too. You sent me an email.
Yeah.
Okay. Right, that should get me caught up. For today, you guys know you had, it wasn't a very extensive handout, worksheet number 7, I believe, for on the cello and the double bass. And, let's go ahead and start opening the floor for questions, if anyone has any. Something that might not have been clear, something that if you want to know, like, how would I prefer that you answer this question, that kind of thing. I'm happy to try to clarify for you if you have any questions on this. Yes?
Was there anything you wanted on the pictures, or was it just orange?
You know, I was kind of hoping you could color them, but no, I'm just kidding. No, absolutely nothing needed on the picture. See, this is the kind of humor I get from listening to our department chair, Dave, a lot. He's starting to roll off on me a little bit, so. No, yeah, nothing necessary needed for the pictures, but that's a good question. Seems like they do take up quite a bit of space. I will say that. Something else. Oh, by the way, for the ranges, that when you list ranges, I think I just handed something back. Could you list both the extreme range with the open note head, make sure you do that, and the practical range with the filled-in note head, and list both of those on both ends, the low end and the high end? I think it was just a little bit inconsistent on that handout that I returned, that I graded. Nothing major, no major issues or anything like that, but just make sure you have both the extreme range, the practical range on both the low end and the high end. And like the text, that you distinguish the extreme range and the low range, and the practical range with the open note head and the filled-in note head, respectively. Yeah, okay. Anything else? All right, then, what I've got today is I've got an in-class quiz. This in-class quiz, however, is not copied from your homework. It's just a really brief quiz based on a lecture and what you did on. It's based on that, it's just not copied from your homework. So if you could just keep a pencil out, everything else you should be able to do, hopefully no problem. It's not a very long quiz. Just fill these short questions out, and we'll take about 10 minutes to do so. So let's plan about 1 more minute maybe for this quiz. Very well, I'll come around and pick them up. I'll try to get them back to you on Wednesday. Did anyone happen to draw or a fellow or something on it? Very good. I would like to take just a few minutes and show you the answers for worksheet 7. It shouldn't take very long since it's a brief handout. And I do have this thing working at least, so. You did not have to use a treble clef to show the range of the instruments. I just decided to use one so that I wouldn't have to use a ton of ledger lines. But you can just, however you can get the right pitches there. The practical high range for the cello, as you can see, is C5. And then the extended range is a little bit higher than that, the extreme range, I should say. You did not have to use a treble clef again, just as long as you have those pitches. And the low range, both practical and extreme for the cello is C2, because middle C is C4. That's the reference point. The open pitches of the cello, I hope you remember that they are tuned in perfect fifths. I gave you the lowest note, so if you knew it was all fifths up from there and there's 4 strings on the cello, you could deduce that the remaining open strings would be G, D, and A. Another way to remember that is to remember that these are the same as the open strings on the viola, except they're exactly 1 octave lower than the viola's open strings. Here I was looking for an octave and the tenor clef. And I guess I'm going to zoom back out. So I think for this one here, as long as you got the first few notes started correctly, the rest of it should have kind of followed through okay. Don't worry about, you don't need to have the dynamic marking there. And, but again, as long as you started on the opening first 2 pitches correctly, I think the rest should have fallen into place. Just want to double check what you have there. The double bass, again, you did not need to use the treble clef. I did, again, just to prevent a lot of ledger lines. The low bottom of the written range for the double bass is E2. Does yours have a thing that over on the side that says sounding an octave lower? Okay, mine must be old. I must have added that later. Mine doesn't have that, but at least you have the correct version. By the way, let me know if you have any questions or concerns too as we go through this. On the back side, whoops, the open strings on the double bass, those are tuned in fourths. It's the only one that's different from the rest of the string instruments. So if E is the lowest note, and you remembered it's tuned in fourths, the remaining open strings would be A, D, and G. A, D, and G. And then, let's see here. Yeah, and then I had you notate the sounding pitches at the bottom of the quiz, which would be just an octave, exactly an octave lower than what's written for it on that passage I gave you there. Because we know that the double bass sounds an octave lower than written. That's our first official transposing instrument, so to speak, in this class, even though we've talked about transposition in general already. Okay, questions, concerns, comments? Then you can hang on to that sheet. We have, I have a fair amount of information to cover today, although today, again, barring no unforeseen emergencies, as long as the sound works today, even though it didn't last Wednesday, but if it does, we're going to get into a lot of hopefully interesting things. I'd like to talk first a little bit about the string orchestra in general, with some facts and some details. And then after that, we're going to get into some specifics on actually what are some ways and some opportunities for us to arrange for the strings. What are some different ways that we can get good sounding results, get good balance, be able to hear melodies, things like that, and have a nice full sound for the whole string orchestra. So let me start by saying the strings, and I may have mentioned this before, the strings are sometimes referred to as the backbone of the orchestra. And you do not need to write all of these, I think I've got about 7 or 8 points that I'm going to use to support that statement that I just gave you. You don't have to write them down in your notes. They are given to you and listed for you on page 32 of your textbook. But I just want to highlight them quickly here. Some of the reasons the strings are considered to be the backbone of the orchestra. Number one, as a group, they have an enormous range. Just think about the very lowest pitch that the double bass can sound, and the screaming high, super high, very highest pitch that a violin professional player could maybe get to. I mean, that range is basically almost everything you got on the piano. Another reason the strings are the backbone of the orchestra, they are very versatile technically. They can do a lot of figuration, a lot of complex fingering, that kind of thing, a lot of difficult music. Also, the warmth of the string sound makes it especially useful. And a lot of you, well, not a lot of you, some of you may feel that, especially when you hear a string instrument played individually, maybe the tone isn't so warm as you were hoping, unless you maybe hear a professional play it or somebody that really knows what they're doing. But when you get all the strings together in a nice large ensemble, they do have a nice blend, they do have a nice warm sound to them. There are a few problems of blend in the string section, but they all have a very similar timbre or tone. Strings have an unusually wide dynamic range. The book talks about how they can get super pianissimo, like double P dynamics. They can get very intimate, and at the same time they can have a full, very robust, super loud, impactful fortissimo, double F. They can span the gamut in terms of dynamics. This may be a little more logical or reasonable reason why they're the backbone of the orchestra. String players do not need to have a lot of rests for breathing and resting their lips. Right? I mean, that makes sense. So string players can play continuously for longer periods than maybe woodwind and brass players can play. Okay? The last reason I have here is that strings generally carry the greatest burden of the playing. If you, and the author talks about this in your reading, if you were to actually take maybe 100 to 1,000 orchestral scores, and you were to look and see how many measures do the string players play for in that piece, how many measures do the woodwinds play for, and how many measures do the brass play for, you'll find that the strings play the most number of measures easily in orchestral scores compared to the other sections of the orchestra. You'll also find out, people have done studies on this, woodwinds actually rank second. So they play the second most amount, I guess, or number of measures in an orchestra. And then, do we have brass players? Yes, we have brass players. You guys play third, you guys play maybe the least number, well, I don't know about the percussion, that wasn't in the study, but that does not, it's not to say you guys aren't important, you are very important. It's just maybe you don't play quite as many measures as the woodwinds and the string players do. Okay, now, although the players of each string instrument, they normally play single melodic lines in unison. Normally, for instance, we have just one melodic line for the first violins, and we have a line of music or a voice of music for the second violins, and the violas, and so on and so forth. But it is not uncommon to divide each group of instruments into two parts, with each part playing different notes. And what I mean by that, I'll see if I can illustrate that by showing you example number 3-4 on page 36. And I'm hoping to, again, as long as cross your fingers, as long as the sound works, I'm hoping to play some of these for you later on in the class. But if you were to look at this example on page 36, do you see how, for instance, the violas, which are right in the middle of that string section, do you see how they are divided? Okay? They're divided. And that's one thing that when it comes to strings in particular, not when it comes, it doesn't apply necessarily to brass and woodwind instruments. Okay? But with strings, since you have you may have 16 first violins playing, 14 second violins, 12 or 10 violas, maybe 8 cellos, and maybe a half a dozen double basses. It's not uncommon to divide each group of instruments into two parts, with each part playing different notes. So you see the violas, they're divided. Let's say you had 10 violas in this orchestra. Maybe 5 could take the lower notes, and 5 could take the top notes. Now, what is it in the music that tips us off? What tells us that the violas, besides the fact that they have multiple notes per beat, what tells us that they should be divided?
In the second measure, the top line, second beat has a quarter note.
Okay, that certainly would be one way that you'd be able to tell that. What's another way?
It says DVC.
Yeah, do you see the DIV above the first beat? That is an abbreviation for DVC. Okay? And when we score for strings and you want one of the string instruments to be divided or split, we use the term divisi to indicate that. And the abbreviation is sufficient. The abbreviation is just DIV. Okay? That directive, that abbreviation has to be there when you want a particular instrument to be divided. It's a place above the staff next to the passage, as you can see there. In ordinary divisi writing, the two parts can usually be written on the same staff, as it's shown here with the violas. Both parts are written on the same staff with the alto clef for violas. Now, if the two parts involve the same rhythmic durations, a single stem can be used for both. And that's what most of these are in this short example. You see how there's just one stem direction or a single stem for almost everything there? It's because the rhythmic values are the same. When the rhythmic values of two parts are different, however, separate stems pointing in separate directions are necessary. And that's what you were pointing out. In the second measure, beat 2, you see how the rhythms of the two parts are different on that beat. So we have to have opposing stems, different stem directions. The up stem for the higher note, the down stem for the lower notes. Now, let's say beat 2 of measure 2 was just out of there. Let's say all you had to go on was measure 1. And everything was sharing a single stem, same stem direction. And let's say the DIV was not listed there. Let's pretend that the DIV was not indicated. What do you think the viola players would be thinking they'd have to play if they had multiple notes per beat and there was no DIV? Okay, they'd probably be thinking that they have to play double stops. Okay? So you see how confusing it can be if you don't have the DIV there that says divisi, like half of you play this line, half of you play this line. They might think, oh, I'm supposed to be playing double stops or multiple notes of 2 strings at a time. And if that's not what you intended, then you gotta be careful about that. Because that's what they will default to thinking if you don't have the DIV. Okay, so it's really important to have that direction there. Good. Okay. Now, when two parts cannot be conveniently notated on the same staff, maybe because there's repeated crossing, or you have certain wide range differences in range between the two parts, then what you can do is, I'm going to freeze this. Let me show you example 3.6 on page 37. There we go. Take a look especially at the cellos. If you can't conveniently, in other words, if it gets very complicated or very hard to read when you're doing a divisi on the same staff, two parts on the same staff, then you can sometimes use two staffs as the cellos are split up here. And use the abbreviation DIV. Do you see where the abbreviation is? It's out by the instrument voice abbreviation in the left-hand margin. That's that's the normal practice if you use multiple staffs for divisi string, a divisi string instrument. Okay. What else was I going to say? Oh, and by the way, do you see the little extra bracket for the cellos there? Because there's two staves for the same instrument. So you're supposed to use an extra bracket there and have two staves for the same instrument. Now, any or all of the string instruments can be divided. You can have divisi first violins, divisi second violins, divisi violas, divisi cellos, etc., etc. But I would like to in this class, because it's not recommended, and we're just kind of novice, we're learning here. I do not want you ever in this class to do divisi double bases, okay? Do not divide the double bases. I know your book doesn't say that, although it says you probably don't want to do that. I think it recommends it. But no divisi double bases. So for your first project, when you're going to be scoring something for strings, you do not want to split up the double bases. Okay. After a passage that's divisi, when you want the rest of the cellos, let's say, or the violas to go back to all playing the same line of music, then you put a directive in the music that says this. It's an abbreviation for unisono. It's an Italian word for unison. Okay. So in string parts, not in brass parts or woodwind parts, we see a lot of these directives, DIV and UNIS. Divided or divisi, unison. That indicates how the string players are supposed to play their line, when they're supposed to play in unison again. And finally, before I go on to something else, although there are several ways to abbreviate instrument names, let's agree on abbreviating the string instruments just like the book does, so that we're all in agreement, okay? There are many different ways to abbreviate violin, but can we use just VL from this point forward? That's what the book uses. And for viola, can we use VLA? And for cello, can we use VC? And then for double bass, we can use just DB. Does anyone have the initials DB? I was just wondering, like Daniel Boone or something. No, I mean, there's other ways. I mean, you could use CB for contrabass, that kind of thing. There's others, but let's just agree to use these for the string instruments, okay? That way, when you look at the examples in the book, you'll know what's going on and we can all be on the same page. Okay. Let me take a moment here. Does anyone have any questions so far? All right. Then, let's go ahead and start looking at some examples of different ways a short four-voice passage can be arranged or scored for string ensemble. Now, I'm only going to probably be able to show you a few more examples out of the text. And then I need to go to the input source where I get to play stuff. Whoops. So if you have your text with you, now would be a good time to open it up to page 35. Page 35 would be, so because I won't be able to show all the examples on the screen here. And it's really good, it's really important that you watch these examples as you listen to them so you can see what kind of scoring, what kind of arrangement yields what kind of sound, overall sound. So this is what's going to happen here. First of all, let me freeze this. This is example 3.2 on page 35. And just for purposes of illustration, the author has taken this two measures from a Bach, four-voice Bach chorale and said, okay, we're going to arrange this passage here multiple different ways for a string ensemble. Okay. But this is going to be the model. This is what's going to be the model to be used. Short phrase from a four-voice Bach chorale as an example. And by the way, I always like to start with strings in this instrumentation class because I think they maybe represent the easiest section of the orchestra for which to write. And do you know why? Because there's no transposition except for the double bass. And the double bass's transposition, as we know, is just an octave, so it's not all that complicated or unwieldy. So that's kind of why I start with strings before I go on to woodwinds or brass. Okay. Now I'm going to go to the piano and I'm going to play this for you. In fact, I could probably I'll take this over here. So you can hear how it goes. And then hopefully, again, cross your fingers, we're going to hope that the sound works. And we're going to hear different arrangements of string ensemble of this very passage. Okay, so you can see that I actually analyzed mine in the book. You don't need to analyze it. It's in the key of E minor. And a Jesu meine Freude. Maybe that's a familiar melody to you. That's the opening of the chorale. So now, again, if the sound works, you're going to hear this passage like 30 times more. Well, maybe not that many times. Certain, maybe when you see this four-voice, before I show any more examples, when you see this four-voice arrangement, maybe certain scorings of the strings, maybe they suggest themselves more than others, and maybe some are more complicated. For instance, what's one way that you might, what's an easy way to write all these pitches in their various voices for all the strings? Remember, we're going first violins, second violins, violas, cellos, and double basses. What might be something pretty, I don't want to say obvious, but not very complicated?
Just doing it that way?
Yeah. Maybe we could give the soprano line, the melody, to the first violins, right? We could give the alto line to the second violins. We could give the tenor line to the violas. And then we could give the bass line to the cellos. And we could have the double basses maybe have the same line, but they'll just double the cellos an octave lower. Or we could have the double basses rest if you want. But isn't that, I mean, it doesn't take too much thought. You can just go first violin, second violin, viola, cello, right? And that's actually what happens in example 3.3, which is on the bottom of page 35. So again, if you compare to the original example 3.2 on the same page, I tried to put little letters, SATB, as to which violin, which string instrument has which original line. That helps me keep my place. So you can see the first violins, they have the original soprano line, second violins have the alto, violas have the tenor, and the cello and the double bass have the bass line. Now, you see how the double basses are notated the same as the cellos? But they're sounding an octave lower, right? Yeah, sounding an octave lower. Okay, this is where we need a miracle. Give me a minute again and we'll see if this works. First of all, I'm going to connect to the Wi-Fi. that's a good sign so far. Oops, that's not what I wanted. This is what I wanted. Oh, and by the way, I don't know who this guy is, but there's somebody who comes on with these recordings and he says, chapter 3 or whatever it is, example, blah, blah, blah. So you just have to, and then you'll hear the example. So sorry about that, but let's see what happens when we try this.
Chapter 3, the string orchestra. Example 3.3.
Okay, this is the one we just looked at. Okay, I won't do this for every example, but what are your first impressions? How does that sound? Does it sound good? Does it sound bad? Yeah, it sounds pretty good to me. Does it sound like something's out of balance, like something, one of the voices is too loud, or are we getting too much treble? Are we getting too much bass kind of thing? No, I didn't really catch that. I mean, I think it sounds pretty decent. Just the simplest way to arrange those voices for string ensemble.
The string orchestra.
Let's hear it one more time.
Example 3.3.
Next thing we need to talk about is that the range of an original voice, or I should say the range of an instrument, is one of the most important factors in deciding what instrument should play an original voice. Now again, I'm going to need you to go back to always keep your thumb by example 3.2 in your book there. That's where the original notes are. When you look at that example, can you see, let me ask you this, can the violins be given the tenor line? In example 3.2. What do you think? Well, I'm going to say, no, they can't. And do you know why you could not give the original tenor line to any of the violins to play? Yeah, because there's a pitch right in the middle of that tenor line that's just too low. Right? Do you see that F sharp 3? Again, I'd like to be able to go back and forth, but it's way too complicated. The F sharp is too low. Isn't the lowest pitch we just learned in the violins a G? So it'd be impossible. It'd make no sense. It would be not sensible to try to maybe give like the tenor line to the second violins. No way, Jose. They'd throw down their bow and say, what is this? No, no, but they can't play that. They can't play that because the range is just too low for their instrument. Okay? What about this? Could the bass line of the original, could it be given to the violas? What do you think? Yes or no, based on what you know about the viola's range? I would say no. The bass line of the original cannot be given to the violas. Why? Because there's some notes below C3 in the bass line, namely the B's and the A's. The violas cannot play that low. Their lowest string, open string, is C3. They wouldn't be able to get down there. Yeah, let's not get into any technical things yet about, well, they could play the bass line an octave higher, and so, well, let's not even go there just yet, okay? We'll get to that, if not at the end of class, then probably the beginning of next class. Okay, so that doesn't look like an option. But there are some arrangements that we could score for string orchestra that use two string instruments to double the melody maybe, but then if we did that, it would require some Debussy passage in one of the other parts. Okay. And for this, I'm thinking of example, for instance, if you look at example 3.4 on page 36. Maybe you say, I would like to give the soprano, original soprano line, which is the melody of this chorale, I would like to give that more emphasis or more weight. I'd like to bring the melody out. So, for those of you that are looking at example 3.4, which two instruments now are given the melody here? Violin 1 and 2, okay. All the violins, both first and seconds, are playing the melody. Well, if you tie up the first and second, both first and second violins on the melody, then one of the other string instruments is going to have to divide and split to take those other inner lines. And so if you look at example 3.4, you should see that the viola is divisi there. The top line is the original alto line. The bottom line is the tenor line. Alto and tenor. By the way, if it's not clear from now on, I want you to bring your textbook to every class, because it's just, I can't go back and forth, that kind of thing. And you need to be able to compare the notation, what you see, with the sound. Okay? All right, the cellos and the double basses, they're still assigned to the bass in example 3.4. Let's go ahead and listen to example 3.4. This is again all the violins on the melody, but the violas are divisi. Let's try this. Come on. There we go.
3.4.
Okay. To me, it doesn't sound bad. When divisi violas can't work if you have an orchestra with lots of violas. If you only have like 2 to 4 violas, though, you probably don't want to divide that section. You're just not going to get a lot of oomph and a lot of power out of that. So you got to think about your quantities, your numbers too. Okay. In the following example, example 3.5. Here we have all the violins on doubling the melody, but we have the cellos now are divided. The cellos are divided. The top line of the cellos is for the tenor, the original tenor, and the bottom line of the cellos is for the original bass line. So the cellos are divided between tenor and bass.
3.5.
Fine as well. By the way, all of these examples in chapter 3 are good examples to emulate, to use as models, except for one. And I'll get to that in just a second. Example 3.6 is the same as example 3.5. It's just notated with two staves for cello. So I don't think I need to play that one. It should sound the same. Now, example 3.7 on page 38. This is the one that I have crossed out. Because if you do your reading, the author will say that this is an uncommon arrangement. I do not want you to use example 3.7 as a model for your homework and your scoring exercises. You can cross out example 3.7. And what that is what they've done is they've given the melody, the soprano line, to the first violins, but also to some of the cellos way up in the stratosphere. And we don't need to worry about that or deal with that. But the author says it's an uncommon arrangement. Okay. Now, last but not least, let's see here. I gotta give you some points about doubling and divisi and things like this. As a general rule, it is safest to have at least half of the cello section playing the bass line with the double basses sounding an octave lower. In other words, in all your assignments for strings and your scoring for strings, I do not want only the double basses playing the bass line. I always want the double basses playing the bass line with at least half of the cello section. Okay? It's good to always have some cellos playing along with the double basses because it actually provides clarity It provides a fuller sound, better resonance, and more support. You don't necessarily need to all of those reasons, but there's a reason why. I always want at least some of the cellos playing whatever the double basses are playing. If you want to divide the cellos and have half of them play with the double basses and half do something else, that's fine. But let's not have all the cellos do something different than the double basses, at least for now, okay, as we get started. Also, let's avoid having the double basses sound at original pitch. We never, just for the purposes of this class, never sounding at the actual original pitch. Don't do that. We want the double basses to, give you the octave lower support. So we want them always sounding an octave lower than the line they are supposed to take. Okay? So do not have them sound at original pitch. And we already talked about how never divide the double basses. In your reading, you'll find out that you might say, well, why can't I divide the double basses? Why can't half of the double basses sound the line that they're supposed to take at the original sounding pitch, and then the other half can sound an octave lower than those double basses? Well, the author will say that doing that does not work out well in actual practice. The effect is rather disappointing, and it's almost never used in score. So we're not going to split the double basses and have half of them sounding at the given pitch and half of them an octave lower. We're just not going to do that. On occasion, the double basses can play a bass line all by themselves, but the octave doubling with the cellos will provide, again, clarity. It'll bring out the line a lot better. It won't sound so muddy down there because the cellos will bring out some sharpness to it. Okay. Now, besides louder dynamics and more than one part doubling a line at the unison, an important line can actually be brought out by doubling it at an octave away. Okay. And you'll find out that you can actually double soprano lines, alto lines, and tenor lines. You can double them with an instrument an octave higher than written. An octave higher than written. So let me put it over here. S, A, T, B. These lines can all be doubled an octave higher to bring them out. One of the examples where the soprano line of the original, the melody, is actually doubled an octave higher. That's example 3.8. Maybe we can listen to that quickly since we have a few minutes yet.
.6.
Whoops. Hang on. Let me see if I can get 3.8 to come up.
3.8.
There we go. Listen how so that's just one instance. If you want to bring any of the lines out, it can be doubled an octave higher. Now, there's a little bit of warning or beware about this, and I'm going to give you a handout to tell you what you can do when it comes to octave doubling and what you shouldn't do when it comes to octave doubling. So, take one of these and use this for as you do your next homework assignment. So on the left side of this handout, these are the things you can do. They are encouraged to do these things. Did everyone get one? On the right side, these are things you want to avoid. One of the main things you need to know is that when it comes to the inner voices, alto and tenor, the author makes a big point to say, you can double both the alto and the tenor voices an octave higher in your arrangement, but don't choose one or the other to double an octave higher only. In other words, he says, do not just choose to double the alto line an octave higher, but not the tenor line. Because what you do is you end up getting these gaps of fourths and fifths because you've got this extra layer going on top and it doesn't sound that great. Okay? Well, we don't need to go into too much detail there, but the point is, if you're going to double the alto line an octave higher, then double the tenor line also an octave higher. If you don't want to double the tenor line an octave higher, then don't double the alto line either. It's either you double both of them an octave higher or none of them, the inner voices. Okay, and that's kind of pointed out on your sheet there and also in your reading. Okay? One other point I need to make before we go, and I know we're running out of time, is this. When I talk about doubling in an arrangement, you need to understand that doubling a voice an octave higher is different than moving a voice from its original pitch. If I have an original line that's written like this, CBA, and I want to double that an octave higher, it doesn't mean that I can just take it away from this original register, this original octave, and just start doing something like this, CBA. That's moving the voice. We never want to, we always want to have at least one instrument, some instrument playing the original voice at the original pitch level, in the original octave. Does that make sense? So doubling means you can do this. See, now I've got some instruments playing it at the original octave and an octave higher. But you can't just take something from its original octave and move it and then don't have an instrument playing at its original pitch level. So there's a difference between doubling something an octave higher. That means actually adding another voice on top of something at its original pitch level. That's a different than actually moving the entire voice and not having any instrument at its original pitch level anymore. We don't want that. We always got to have at least one instrument sounding the given line at the original octave or the original pitch level. Does that make sense? Okay. That's all I'm going to be able to get to today. But between your reading and the handout that I gave you, you should have enough. The assignment for Wednesday is to take this little two-measure passage down here, SATB, kind of like in your book, it's just a different passage, and score it or arrange it 3 different ways for string orchestra. Just have to choose 3 different ways. Use the examples in your book as models, except for example 3.7. But any of the other ones should work as good examples, okay? And let me know if you have questions. Come see me if you need help between now and Wednesday. And when you get this, I guess you can go ahead and go. Say that one. Yeah, like three of the many different examples. Yeah, like you could do the first one that was very basic. You know, where the violin one takes the soprano, that would be one. And then another way could be using the V. And another way could be doubling a line an octave higher. Yeah.
We're not.
You got it. Is that full Harley?
It's like
Yes, let me get one. I'm just going to shut off the recording here for a second.